I'm now the director of a mission organization for the last 20 years, but I'm coming to you tonight to say, cancel the missions program. Now, obviously I'm playing with you a little bit here, but there's a couple of problems that I have with missions programs. First of all, there's an S on the end of mission. There is only one mission. And I realize it sounds right, it doesn't say right to say mission program, but maybe it does need to sound right to say that. But we tend to think that missions is sort of one of the things that we do. You know, we've got, and the other exception I take to that is the word program. You know, we've got a music program, we've got a youth program, we've got a children's program, we've got, you know, this program and that program, and we've got all these different programs. Oh, and by the way, let's have a missions program. And so we program missions. Now my exception is this. Mission, there's only one mission for the church. We've got one mission for being on planet Earth. So it shouldn't be plural, and it shouldn't be a program. And what I want to do is, before we get into three more of the things that I think it would be good for us to think about, I want to sort of set the table and give you a model that would get us a little bit away from that idea of missions sort of being something we have over here. Oh yeah, we have a committee and they sort of handle that, and we hope they stay out of our way, and we'll give them a little bit of money to do that with, but that's not really who we are. I mean, it's one of the things we are, but not who we really are. And so what I want us to do is to think a little bit more broadly, first of all, because I'm going to set a model before you that is a bit more holistic for the church. So when you think in terms of missions, plural, that you think in terms of mission instead, singular, and what is that mission of the church, so that what we're doing that we traditionally call missions, and we traditionally sort of think is somewhere outside of the United States and it's a different language and a different culture, that we reference that instead as being international ministries rather than missions per se. And one of the problems with missions, though we use it all the time, is this very issue that becomes almost, you know, too commonplace. And so I'm deliberately trying to use some different terminology to get us thinking maybe a little bit differently from what we have in the past. This passage of Scripture is one that needs no introduction to you, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time exegeting it. Though at some point you might want to stop at that first word and take a look at it. Obviously, if the word but is there, it's contrasting something, and the word right before it, remember, the disciples had come and they said, is now going to be the time that you're going to bring in the kingdom? And the disciples were obviously fed up with Rome having its boot on their neck, and they wanted free of this domination of this foreign government. And perhaps it was a legitimate question asking about the millennial kingdom and wondering, is now the time for that? But I can't help but wonder, because of some of their backgrounds, especially those that were a little bit more political, whether this was a political question. Is now the time that we're going to get rid of Rome and we get to have you as our king instead? And sometimes, especially for us as Americans, we get a little bit political in our churches and in our mindset, and the rest of the world doesn't really process this stuff the same way we do. They don't really look at patriotism and America the way we may have that affinity. So the word but is a contrast to what they asked as a question. He's basically saying, look, don't worry about that, because I want to get your mind on a mission. I want to get your mind focused on something that needs to be accomplished. What is that? Well, he tells us right here, you shall receive power after the Holy Ghost has come upon you, and you shall be, and there's a little bit of debate as to whether that is an imperative or a statement of fact. Is it prophetic, or is it saying you will be? And we won't get into that right now, but you shall be my witnesses. And there's four arenas, and here's where I want us to sort of think in terms of a framework for fulfilling the mission of the church. Jesus defined four arenas of ministry: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the uttermost part of the world, of the earth. First of all, Jerusalem. Obviously, that was the city in which they found themselves. And so there was a place that they were ministering where they could actually see people, contact them, relate to them on a daily basis. It was their mission field, if you want to put it that way, because that's where they lived. Those were the people they were concerned about. So does every church today have that same thing? Yeah, it may not be called Jerusalem. It may be called Sacramento. It might be called Los Angeles, but you have a Jerusalem. Every church also has a Judea. Now, Judea, of course, is that region around it. It was half of Israel. And so, maybe you could say the similarity would be the county or the state or even the country. In other words, the region in which you find your Jerusalem is also another arena of ministry that the local church needs to have. The third is the Samaritans. And you know the history of where the Samaritans came from. When they were taken off into captivity, the Samaritans had moved in, they took over their homes and their farms and businesses, and they came back, and one of the reasons why they hated them so much was because they were squatters. And they'd basically taken over their property. And so there was this tension between the Jewish nation, who was now coming back from captivity and finding these foreigners that had sort of invaded and taken over. And so they were people of a different culture. And so as we try to superimpose or try to understand the generalities of what Jesus is telling them, he's saying you need to be concerned about a Jerusalem. You need to be concerned about a Judea. In other words, the region around you could be your state. You also need to be concerned about cross-cultural ministry of those within near distance of you. There are some people that are not like you, and you're going to have to go cross-culture. You might even have to go cross-language, even though they live in close proximity. And today we have those wonderful opportunities and the United States has sort of been this way because of all the immigration over the years and the influx of people still to this day all over the place. You can go and find every people group that you can possibly imagine here in the United States. Where we live in Atlanta, I haven't been able to prove this, but I've been told by other mission agencies that are down there, they say that in Atlanta we have a representation, and we have people from every unreached people group in the world living in Atlanta. And so part of the responsibility of the churches in Atlanta is to go cross-cultural to those people that have come in that are not yet speaking English and living the culture like we are used to. And so there is a cross-cultural, local cross-cultural responsibility that a local church has. And then there's the uttermost part of the earth. That's what we traditionally would tend to think of in terms of missions. In other words, we're thinking in terms of sending people internationally or overseas, and we tend to look at that as missions. Let me get one of these if I may. So what I'm proposing to you as a template, as a possible model for organizing mission, not missions, but mission in your church, is using this tool of Acts 1:8. To think in terms of not missions plural, but a mission that has 4 arenas of ministry. In missions, and I'm going to use the word missions in plural just because we're so used to doing that. In missions, there's a little bit of a tension or competition between what we call home missions and foreign missions. And the reality is, if you're having a missions conference and you get some guy in, he's going to go to the jungles of Brazil, and then you also have another guy that comes in and he's going to start a church in Iowa, chances are you're going to want to support the guy in Brazil. He's going to have better stories, he's going to be in the jungle, he's a long ways away, those poor natives, they need to be reached. And so oftentimes home missions, and in our IFCA extension we have that same problem. It's sort of the stepchild of missions, and they're viewed almost as a secondary thing that, okay, we'll do it, and so we sort of sideline them. And so the guy that's going to go to Africa and swing by vines through a jungle has a much better chance of getting support than the guy that's going to go down, to the next county and start a church. It's just the way it is. Part of that is created because of this model that we created in our minds, not the one that Jesus created. Jesus says it's not either or. You can't say, I'm going to do Jerusalem and I'm going to also do Samaria, but I'm going to forget Judea and I'm going to forget the other. And normally what happens is that many of our churches, we're pretty good at Jerusalem. leave those two there in the middle alone. We're not reaching cross-culturally the people that are in our area, and we're also not necessarily thinking in terms of church planting in our region. And if I'm reading Jesus correctly here, he is concerned about all four of those arenas, and I don't have the option of saying I'm going to choose one over the other. The bottom line is we've got to do all four. We have to be reaching people for Christ in our city. We have to be reaching people for Christ in our state. We have to be reaching people in our state that are a different culture than us. And at the same time, we need to be sending people overseas. So I throw that out as an idea and as a model for you to think in terms of structuring the mission of your church. Instead of having a missions program, understand what the mission of the church is. And we're not going to take the Nazareth Manifesto that we took a look at earlier this afternoon. We're going to stick with Acts 1:8 or Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20. We're going to say we're going to stick with the Great Commission and use this as a template or a model or a framework for doing ministry. Now, the page that I handed out to you gives you a little diagnostic that you can pretty quickly evaluate how your church is doing. You know, what activities are there in each one of these arenas from your church? How much money is budgeted towards them? Probably most of the budget goes in the first column. Secondly, there would be more money, not more, but the second largest amount would probably be in the right-hand column. And we might do a little bit in the two middle columns. But could I suggest to you that if we're going to do what Jesus said, we're going to make sure that there's money in all four columns. And that home missions or church planting here in the United States is not a lesser endeavor than going around the world. We don't really have the option. We've got to do all of them. I realize that immediately raises the bar, complicates things, makes things very difficult, because now I don't have the luxury of just saying, we're going to focus on our neighborhood. Now I've got to be thinking in terms of what about people that are moving into our neighborhood that are a different culture. The Samaritans are here. What am I going to do about church planting in my region, which could be my state or my country? At the same time, what are we going to be doing to establish churches and take the gospel around the world? So if you buy into that and you start evaluating your church based on that, you will begin to see a model or a template that will work in a number of different ways. I'm going to come back to this throughout the next few minutes, but I'm sort of throwing this out here as a model because if you'll take this as a model, it will help you deal with some of the trends that we're going to be talking about here in the next few moments. It might be an interesting exercise one of these days for either the missions committee or for the deacons or the elders or whoever the pastors of the church to actually fill this chart out and see how we're doing. And don't get down on yourself and feel badly if there's some empty slots there. It just helps to evaluate to say, hey, here's some areas that we have opportunity to expand or maybe to do something in the future. It'll help cast a vision for what could be done. And it will give you a more balanced ministry. And it'll also give you a tool for accomplishing some things that I'm going to be talking about here in just a few moments. So if you can sort of buy into some of the things I've been rambling about here for the first few minutes, there are a couple of conclusions that you come to and a couple of presuppositions from which I'm going to operate as I talk for the rest of the evening. First of all, the church is not an end to itself. Now, sometimes we view the local church as a place where I go to get, and we come as consumers and we say, I'm looking for the church because it has this, that, and the other, and as long as we're doing that, we can keep our heads down, we don't have to pay any attention outside the four walls of our building because we're getting what we want here. And there is a lot of good stuff in the local church. That's why Christ designed the local church, because we need the church. There's all kinds of stuff that we have to have that the church provides. But my caution is that we don't view the church as an end to itself. The church is not a place where, as a pastor, I can get a salary, and that's the reason why I'm running this church, because it's kind of good business. The church is not a place where I can go to sort of just fulfill the needs of my family, because I think I have all my kids in a good Sunday school, and I don't want them playing with the pagan kids in my neighborhood. And, you know, we get this consumer mentality, and what I'm trying to help us to say, as I understand the Great Commission, and I understand my ecclesiology, the church is not an end to itself. You know, I used to think of the local church as a ceramic mug. And as a church planter, I was doing that because I was saying, I'm going to have to work and work and work until I get this thing perfect, bake it, it's going to be around forever. But you know, the problem is there's no local church that is forever. Every church has a lifespan. It may last for 3 weeks, it might last for 3 years, it might last for 30 years, it might last for 300 years, but there are no churches around from Paul's day. They don't exist. They all go out of existence. And I swapped my ecclesiology to start thinking in terms of the local church as being a paper cup. You see, the local church is the container in which ministry takes place, but it is a temporary thing. The local church is. The universal church is forever. But the local church, each local church is temporary. And if you don't believe that, just look around, because there are churches that come and go. It doesn't matter how strong a church is today, within about 2 years, it could be out of existence. And so a church is a very fragile thing. In our world, one of the problems of viewing the church this way is, if a missionary views the church this way, he stays forever. Because the church will never be perfect enough. And I can't train people enough, and it's never going to survive without me, and so I've got to stay there for the next 40 years being a missionary, being the pastor of that church, because I'm looking for a ceramic mug, right? But if we can view the local church as a paper cup, it's a temporary holder for ministry, and ministry needs to take place within the local church. Evangelism, discipleship, training, all the rest of that, that is meant to be done within the context of the local church. This does the job. It gets the drink to my mouth. It accomplishes the thing that God wants us to. I read somewhere the other day, let me back up and put it this way. One of the characteristics of a missionary is we all see ourselves as dispensable, and success for us is working our way out of a job. In other words, a pastor doesn't necessarily think that way, because you sort of think, I'm going to be here for the next 30 years, and I'm going to keep shepherding these flock and caring for them, and that's my job. A missionary doesn't think that way. A missionary says, my job is to go in and do something and equip other people and back out, and success for me is when I can leave and they don't need me anymore. So we think a little bit differently, maybe than other people in other kinds of ministry, because success for us is that. But one of the problems is when a missionary has this mindset about his church, he'll stay forever because it's not quite perfect. We've got to get some more colors in there, and if I leave, it's not going to be exactly how I crafted it. And so we're so concerned about getting this thing perfect when we realize that, but when we begin to realize it's the paper cup, it starts changing our approach towards what we're doing in church planting. I read the other day the statement, every ministry is an interim ministry. You know, we tend to look at interim pastors. In other words, we've got a pastor who's been there for 20 years, and then we're looking for a pastor, but before we get the guy that we really want, we'll have you come in for 18 months. So we call him an interim pastor. But you realize all of us are interim? Yeah, you might last for 30 years, but you're interim. You're not going to be around forever. Okay? We're all dispensable. We're all temporary. And every local church is temporary. It's going to be raised up by God for a while to do a job, and it'll do it well, but it's not going to be forever. And so we're not starting local churches that are eternal. We're working with people who are eternal. The mission is make disciples, which encompasses all that it takes to bring a person to Christ, to help them to grow in Christ, to help them to be productive in Christ. All that happens within the context of the local church. So that's what I mean when I say the church is not an end to itself. Now, I'm sort of laying a foundation here so you know where I'm coming from when I start moving into the things I want to talk about here tonight. But I want to throw out a model for you to think of as we think in terms of the mission of the church. So missions is not a guy in a pith helmet like my dad who pioneered in a Jeep into Nigeria, and he's the only guy that's the missionary. There is a mission for the church that includes that, but it also includes what you're doing here in your town. It includes what you're doing in your state. It includes with what you're doing cross-culturally with people that are in your community, the Samaritans that are there. Are you with me so far? Did anybody want to push back yet? Before I go on, because I'm going to start building on this foundation, so if we don't have a foundation here.
If you don't have a balanced foundation, what I've experienced coming out of the pastor and going into missions is trying to raise your support. problem? What is the problem with foreign missions today and raising funds to go to the field? Is the weak financial base of foreign missions is because home missions is either failing or its financial base is maxed out. Years and years ago, we heard from a mission executive, a foreign missionary, was bringing out this problem years ago when I was a pastor, and what he said is, I would encourage you to balance out your budgets to have 50% of your budget for home missions and 50% for foreign, because if we don't continue to do church planting in America, the financial base of foreign missions is going to become very, very shallow, and we are there, okay? We're there in our fellowship. Our missionaries are having a tremendous time. When I hear, I raised $5,000 for 2 people. You go to a mission like your mission or our mission, Baptist Food Mission, has been in existence for a long time. Probably your dad, another mission since 1930. Good night. A person with 4 children today going to some place in the world, having to raise $6,000 to support 4 family people, 4 children, and 2 adults. Man, what's happening if they're on deputation for a long, long time? I was on deputation for 4 years, okay? 4 years, 4 months, and 2 weeks, okay? I went right down to the week. And I was going to churches of longtime friends who knew you, knew what you were doing, would have confidence in you. But you know, it's kind of a strange thing for a missionary to walk into church and one of your friends said, you know, Gary, we don't have any money to support you as a missionary. We're maxed out. Okay? And a lot of churches are supporting missions, but they're maxed out. If we don't do more of what you're saying, not only, I would say, Jerusalem missions and Judea missions and home missions, and plant more churches that have and raise up our standard of support levels in America, foreign missions is going to be extremely difficult. It is right now. That's just a perspective I've learned in trying to raise support. And I look at these young couples coming out and going into the mission field today, and when they say, I have to raise $6,500 to go to some foreign field to take care of my family and myself, I just scratch my head and go, oh, you better hang on. I don't know if you would comment on this. People have said, like deputation, a lot of people are for deputation very strong. As you mentioned this afternoon, 50%, one church, 50%, and very little. I've heard this, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've experienced, and that is deputation is a good test of the character of a missionary preparing for the field. Somewhere along the line, could you answer that with this whole thing you're talking about?
Okay, we're going to talk about money here in just a little bit,
okay.
so I'll get into that. I do agree with you that church planting here in the United States is critical for international ministries. That's why I've always been a fan of the extension ministries of the IFCA and done everything I can to encourage and to try to make that happen. But the reality is, we're not that balanced in that. We would rather throw money overseas than in the state in which we live. I'm suggesting we've got to take a look at the macro picture here, and if we're going to follow this model that home missions, if you will, or planting churches in our region has to be a priority. Yep.
I'll just concur. I'm a church planter in the U.S. I went to 60 churches in 2 years, and a lot of people struggle on top of this, and it's tough for them to grasp that. I'll just concur.
Now, obviously, we're very, I have ulterior motives in all this. You know, my heart, not because I disagree with the first 3, but it's just God has put me into international ministries. That's sort of where my life has been, and most of our work at BMW is overseas, so we have some here in the United States. But I know that we will not have overseas missions unless we have a strong base back here doing these 3 things. And the thing that I rejoice on, every time a church is planted, is potential for new missionaries and new money for missions.
So I told him, he said, take me on first so I can save some more missionaries.
Exactly. So if you'll stop talking about missions programs, like I tried to encourage you at the beginning, and start thinking about the mission of the church, and realize there are arenas of ministry that we have to be involved in, it'll start changing your mindset about this. The second point that I made.
Just one comment. This thinking that has been for a long time must change. That foreign missions is more important than local missions, as you brought out. Because if we don't change that thinking, that home missions must be as important as foreign missions, and pour money like that as foreign mission, that a mission executive many years ago said to us, and when I heard it, we went to the home, got with the leaders of the church, we're going to change. We're 80%, like 20% a home, 80%, we're changing. We're just going to, little by little, and we're going to get up to 50. But that must change, and when I come back and say to people, like this brother here, 60 churches, and did he raise all of his support? My land, I went to many churches, and I would say over 60% of them couldn't afford to take on another missionary, okay? So we need to change that thinking. No, home missions is extremely important, because just like you just said, just before I interrupt you, is that if we don't, foreign missions is going to almost come to be so impossible to get our missionaries out on the field.
We're talking a little bit about that, the financial thing here, because it is becoming more and more of a challenge. The second presupposition that I put up there is, what if we would start thinking in terms of missionaries, be they working in Judea, Samaria, or the uttermost part, as part of our staff? In other words, just like you have maybe a youth pastor or an assistant pastor of some sort, or a music minister, you also have missionaries, and you view them at the same capacity as one of your staff members. We don't have time to tease that out, but I'm coming from that presupposition that the missionaries are not sent by the mission agency. The local church sends them. They're really part of your church staff. Now, I'm simply throwing that out without explaining any more than that, because I'm going to come back to that in just a few moments. So this template here, I want to start building on that, and I want to come back to it a few times as we comment. So that's sort of how I view the mission of the church. That's why I'm saying cancel the missions program. Let's do the mission that God has given to us. We're going to have to think in terms of taking the gospel to every person in the world, everywhere in the world. And those are at least 4 arenas that we ought to be thinking about. Now, we've already looked at a couple of trends or issues that are surfacing right now in missions, the compassion or the social justice issues. We talked about that this afternoon. We also talked about the next generation of missionaries and what they're like, and maybe how we can encourage them and help them to be successful if we're going to launch another generation of missionaries from North America. And realize that there's no guarantee that'll happen. You realize that at one time, England, Scotland was the powerhouse of missions. That's where all the missionaries came from. And today, they are now a receiving country for missions. Already, missiologists are telling us that the United States and Canada, North America, is probably 3rd or 4th in line by way of missionary sending countries. And we are no longer the #1 missionary country in the world. And we're slipping. We sort of peaked back in the 70s and 80s, but it's on the decline now in the United States. And there could be a day in which basically our kinds of churches and the church in general is just sort of, we become so secular it's out of existence. And other countries, like we're sending missionaries to England and Scotland, they're going to be coming here to minister to us. So let's not assume that just because we have a great history that that's going to happen forever. We have a responsibility in our generation to keep this thing going. And so we've got to think in terms of what do we do, what is our responsibility right now, how do we help this next generation to go. In view of that, I want to talk about 3 concepts or 3 ideas that are on the horizon of missions. The first one is that of tent making or business as mission. Tent making and business as mission are slightly 2 different things. Tent making is normally taken from the Apostle Paul's life, where for a short period of time he actually made tents. He worked with his hands to support himself financially. So we tend to use that term in missions. Tent making is a guy that has some kind of a skill that he can go out and get a job, and instead of getting support from you, he is able to simply support himself by his skills. Business as mission is slightly different in that you actually go and start a business in a country, and there's a variety of reasons for doing some of these things, but this is an up-and-coming trend or direction in missions in the future. The way we have done this up until now is primarily for a person from the United States to get 100% of their support from churches or individuals here in the States and then go to the mission field. That is really a bit of an aberration here for the last 200 years in the United States. It wasn't part of church history. We have had sort of a nice, comfortable run with this for the last 150 years, at least maybe a couple hundred years, where we've been able to do it that way, and it works well in an affluent culture that wants to give. But it wasn't always this way that missions was done by churches paying a missionary's full salary for them to go somewhere. Famous people like William Carey, who went to India, father of modern missions, worked a job, and he had a number of businesses that he ran there on the mission field in India. 95% of the profits went towards the ministry and supporting other missionaries. And he just poured, he was able to do some things because he had certain skills where he was self-supporting as he ministered. He put it this way: we have held it to be an essential principle in the conduct of missions that whenever practicable, missionaries should support themselves in whole or in part through their own exertions. He's the one that sort of coined the term, my business is to witness for Christ. I make shoes to pay my expenses. And so this has been part of missions actually from the time of Christ. Paul had some times where people would support him, other times he had to work in order to support himself. David Livingstone, who we sort of all look up to in Africa, but there's a lot of questions about him, but he was a guy that basically supported himself because he got these contracts with different people to do exploration. One of the greatest movements of missions in church history was among the Moravians in Germany, and that whole movement in which, that whole group of people in which 1 out of 3 people were missionaries, was entirely financed by guys taking their skills somewhere around the world. And they'd pack up their toolkit and they'd go and just start the business there. And they all supported themselves. So though the Moravians had 1/3 of their membership out doing mission around the world, they weren't supporting them. They were all supporting themselves. So down through church history, we've had a lot of this happening. And so for a couple hundred years or so here in North America, we changed the model and we supported missionaries 100%. We are going through, and it looks like we're going through a trend right now where that is reversing, and we are going back more and more towards tent making. Now, part of that is driven simply by the next generation detests the idea of trying to raise support. So they're doing it out of the fact they don't want to have to go raise support. I do believe, well, we don't have time to get into that right now, but the point is, there is a change and a shift coming where people are going to be tent makers, where they just go and get a job somewhere overseas, or they're going to go start businesses as a legitimate way to get into that country. Someone has said there's no such thing as a closed country, if you don't mind whether you come back or not. In other words, you can go one way, and there's no closed countries. You might die, they might kill you when you go there. But we tend to, in the missions world, talk about creative access countries. We talk about countries, you know, that are limited access, so we've got all different kinds of terms like that. But there are places where you can't go to their consulate and get a visa and go live and minister in their country. A lot of countries you can. You can apply for a missionary visa, or Christian workers visa, or religious workers visa. They'll give that visa to you, and you're legitimately there. But the majority of the world that we have not done a good job of reaching are places where you can't get that kind of a visa. And so now we have to be a little bit more creative in how to get in there, and therefore tent making and business as mission are ways in which we're able to get legitimately in there and minister in these countries. And so it provides access into some countries that typically would be hostile towards us. It also provides sustained contact with people, because one of the problems is you come in as a missionary and supported entirely from the outside. People can't fathom who you are, and if you're working in the industry or in the economy of where you're ministering, you're rubbing shoulders with lost people, and they can sort of fathom who you are. And so there are places that evangelistically, especially as you're starting up a new church, it is to your advantage to be actually working a job. And so sometimes missionaries work a job not in order to earn money, but simply because it gives them access to lost people. We are facing a phase right now in world economy where the dollar is becoming more questionable and in many instances much more weak. There was a time where you used to be able to go in with the US dollar and sort of just dominate. But now the dollar is losing a lot of its buying power around the world. We're not the main currency that we used to be, so that our dollars are not going as far. And so one of the reasons why it costs so much to support a missionary is not because missionaries are earning a lot more, it's just that when you trade in one of ours for one of theirs, you're getting a whole lot less. And so we don't have the buying power. And so there's a diminishing buying power of the US dollar that we have to face up to. Part of the advantage of the tent-making business and mission model is you operate in that economy rather than in this economy. Obviously, if we were to excel in tent-making, we could radically expand the number of missionaries that we have. Right now, we're sort of dependent upon the lid of our budgets. But what if other people would say, I'm not going to take support because I'm going to go get a job overseas. You don't need to support me financially. We could mobilize a lot of people into missions like the Moravians and radically expand the number of missionaries that we have. They say that there's, at any one given time, a couple of million Americans living overseas somewhere. What if we could get just 10% of those people that are living and working overseas? Most of them are going to work in embassies or industry or something. What if we got only 10% of them to go very deliberately because they want to be a missionary? We could radically expand our missionary outreach from the United States without spending another dollar. I'm not suggesting we just stop spending money on missions. I'm just saying we've got to think in terms of how do we expand radically the number of missionaries that we have. Yes?
Yeah, really to maximize that philosophy too is, I would say that we have to change our whole way of thinking of preparation. We tend to think along the lines of degrees, and you have to have certain programs to get your bachelor's and then your master's and all that goes into that, because we as a society and even in the world, the degree means a lot. But so for somebody to go, even to do a tent maker, number one, they got to have the degree, and number two, they have to have a trade. Whereas a lot of people are faced with this dilemma: is because nowadays we don't grow up learning a trade typically. And so if we learn a trade, it's generally after we graduate high school, we choose what we want to do, and then we get that training. And so now we got to get that training in a trade, and then we get our training theologically in the languages and all that. So there's a little bit of that I think that we have to rethink to make the process a little more smoother. And even within the local churches, because I think we've depended so long on Bible colleges and seminaries to do all the training of people that have a burden to do this kind of work. And we have our Sunday schools and some discipleship ministries, but anything deeper than that, we haven't typically been doing. So as I'm thinking about that, because like the tent making, you're working a job and trying to reach. And I was basically a tent maker myself, and all the things that people expect from a church, at least in the United States, you're trying to do that, but at the same time you're working 40 hours, pumping ice cream or whatever. It could be difficult because every individual wants your personal attention and all that. But anyway, going back to just the preparation, the rethinking of how we prepare missionaries to be these tent makers. Do you see that process that we typically have been doing needs to be streamlined?
Yeah, that is very much. You've hit several points there that if we're going to buy into this idea of sending people overseas as tent makers, there's a lot that we're going to have to rethink about what it takes to be a missionary, what the qualifications are, how you prepare them. And there are some interesting things happening today in education, especially in Christian education, that are helping us to accelerate this and to handle it very easily. I recommend if someone's gonna go get a profession, and they wanna be a professional, that they, when they get out of college, that they join an international company that has the likelihood of transferring them somewhere overseas. So we start thinking strategically that way. In the same time, we're going to have to think in terms of how do we train these people for what they can do. From one side of the coin, you got to look at it this way. If you know John 3:16 and you can explain it, you know more theology than probably 90% of the world's population. So to a certain extent, everybody in the pews has incredible potential if we would just unleash it. Now, I realize it takes more than that to establish a church and to train leaders overseas. But that's where I think if we can use a blend and a combination of those that have been trained traditionally in the seminaries and colleges with those that are tent makers, it's a winning combination because the tent maker can make contacts, they can focus on evangelism, they can be a stabilizing factor in a new endeavor. So I think one of the areas that we have not leveraged as well is this side of it. We've done the other side very well, I think. We need to add this. So there's a lot of things that we need to start considering. I just jotted down a few things that are ramifications to thinking this through. For instance, when you send a tent maker, will you commission them the same way that you do a traditional missionary? Will you have a commissioning service? And say, we're sending you as a missionary to Germany, even though you're going to work for Fluor, and you're going to be employed by them, but we're going to send you as a missionary, we're going to commission you just as if you were going. Will they be listed as one of your missionaries? You know, on your board in the back, will they be listed there? You're not giving them any money, but would you list them as a missionary? Will they receive the same kind of prayer and encouragement and accountability and contact from you as the guy that is receiving his full support from you? There's issues of how do they fit into the team on the field because their time schedule just doesn't coincide with the other missionaries that are there. Do you want that tent maker to join a mission agency? Yeah, he's going to work for, you know, this company overseas, but you want him part of a mission agency, even though we're not processing any funds. Do you want that infrastructure or support system that a mission agency provides for him to be a tent maker? Is that a good thing for you to do? What is the impact on the local people? What about citizenship in those countries and visa issues? How do you handle some of the marriage and family issues that are there? What about terms of service, where we tend to think in terms of somebody going for 2 to 4 years on the field that they take a furlough, but a guy that's employed, you know, he's not going to do that. Maybe he's got some vacation time, he can come back and report to the church. So it's a different model, it's a different way of looking at this. We are, as a mission organization, trying to adjust our thinking and our systems so that we can flex with this. We, at this point, we have already made the shift. In the past, you had to have 100% of your support from North America in order to be a missionary before you could go. We've said, we don't care where your money comes from. Your money doesn't define whether you're a missionary or not. Your ministry does. And so it's feasible within our organization for a person to raise some support here, to raise some support in Australia, and work 10 hours a week. Our issue is transparency and accountability. And so we are guaranteeing people that support such a person that they will not rip you off. In other words, they're not going to raise all their support and then go get a job and basically have a double salary. And we, as a mission agency, have the systems to follow and track that so that you're not getting ripped off as a donor or as a church that is giving towards a missionary. So we've already made that adjustment in our thinking to say, we're not going to define a missionary anymore about where their money comes from.
Yes, a question. In order to answer those questions you just asked, it seems to me, what you have to define is the tent maker in your definition. Is he going out to do the Great Commission work? Is he going out to plant a church? Is he going out to minister? Or he's just not going out and answering those questions to make a financial profit. Now, in my country, when I'm listening to you, it is against the law for a foreign missionary to earn money personally for himself. What they like you to do is earn money, like we've had a confession, we had a ranch of 300 cattle, and they were raising money to benefit yourself. It has to be raised and poured back into the lives of Zambia through your ministry. They allow that, but they would never allow me right now as a foreigner to go to their country and set up a business to make profit for myself and then to distribute it as I see fit. They wouldn't allow that. It all has to be distributed to, so it seemed like those two things. Is this Ted Maker, you're defining a person that's in ministry? If he's in ministry, why wouldn't I consider him the same as any other missionary?
I'm saying that you're defined by your vision and your cause. In other words, the ministry that you're doing. If you're just getting a job in Germany because you like Germany and you think you'll earn more money there, and you're just going because it's lark, then you're not a missionary. But if you're going and saying, my main agenda there is the Great Commission, the mission of the church, and I'm going to be able to pay my way because of doing that. By the way, right now there are thousands of jobs in Germany for people that want to work in IT. They're just craving, and it's bizarre. I guess what I'm saying is there is no boilerplate template anymore that works everywhere for everybody. And so my plea to you as a church is to think in terms of some flexibility and some differences, that every model and every missionary that comes along could be different from the next one. And I'm saying that's okay. Now you as a church may not say that's okay, but I'm saying we've got to flex, because there you can't do that, but you move over to the next country and you can. You know, one place you can go in and you can invest and you can build a business and you can support it yourself as well as a dozen other missionaries, and that's legitimate. Other places you can't do that. So every country is so different. And we're living in a very complex world today. And so we've got to, I think, flex more in missions than perhaps we ever have before. We used to have this one model, and so we had nice, neat financial policies, and everything sort of fit in a neat little package. Well, right now it's getting pretty messy, and I think we've still got control over it. We're not letting this thing run rampant. But the point is, we are able to deal with this thing attempting. Well, I don't want to go any further on this because we're going to run out of time. I want to talk about two more issues if I can before we wrap this up. I want to talk about the issue of the call. What I mean by that is this. In the past, we used to talk a lot about the call. Today, we don't so much anymore. People say, I was called into missions, or I was called into the pastorate, or I was called into ministry. I don't hear that being discussed a lot today, and I don't want to be here sort of arguing this point tonight. We spend the rest of the night just talking about how you define the call. We have a definition that we use for our mission, but I won't even get into that because I don't want to start that debate right now. But the point is, as you start thinking in terms of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost part of the world, who's going to staff that? Are they going to be tending? Are they going to be self-supporting? Are they going to pay their salary? It becomes a little bit not quite so easy to define this thing, does it? And all of us are called in a number of different ways. If you trace that term down through Scripture, we're all called as believers. So who's a missionary and who's not? You know, who's this and who's not that? And this becomes a little bit more complex, and particularly, excuse me, particularly in with millennials, they are thinking a little bit differently than we have in the past. As I mentioned in this afternoon session, they're thinking in terms of a 1-year commitment, a 2-year commitment. I came across this stat the other day, and I can't verify because I don't have all this, but I sort of trust the document I got it from. I forgot to write it down who it was. But these are the stats right now for what we would call missionaries. There's about 43,000 that we would call traditional missionaries that have been sent from, and this is just all the sort of evangelical, fundamental, independent churches in North America. You put us all together, there's only about 43,000 of us. That's not very many. Do you realize that the Mormon church has double that? Now, they're all young guys and gals, but they've got twice as many as all the rest of us put together. That number is down about 20-30% from the 70s and 80s. So of the people that have sort of become lifers, they've committed to more than just going one term, they're going to keep going back. They say there's about 40,000, 43,000 of them. There's 8,000 who are more midterm. They said, I'm going to go work for a project, and I'm needed there on this field to do something for 4 years, and there's about 8,000 of those. There's 150,000 people that have said, I'll give you 1 year. That's it. And then there's 1.5 million that'll take a 1 or 2 week trip. Now, just sort of take those stats. What does that tell you about, you know, the stats can be meant to make anything, I realize that, but anything sort of jumped off the page there? What are those stats, what strikes you about that? All right, there is a short-term commitment. Now, some would say that's very positive because if we can get people out there doing stuff, at least maybe they'll get interested.
I don't think people on short term in many of the thinking, because we did a number of short-term things in the church. I don't think any of those people thought they were called. They were led to do that for a couple of weeks. In comparison to a missionary they were supporting, would definitely, because if you serve on mission boards, and many of you have, as I have, when a new missionary comes in, the first thing they examine is called to service. God called you to do this work. So it seems like the long-term committed person would be more concerned about a call than a short-term person. That's been our experience.
Right now, in North America, we're spending $2 billion with a B dollars a year on short-term trips, that bottom line. So it seems like money is not really the issue. Because we got $2 billion to spend on this. We don't have that for the top line, but we do have it for the bottom line. So the money is there. And there's probably a whole lot more than that. So that's a lot of money. Now, while we have been spending, and this is more recent, this is probably the last decade we've been, well, about the last 7, 8 years we've been spending $2 billion. Before it was like $1 billion, but it's been bumped up. So for the last couple of decades, we have invested a lot of money, billions literally of dollars from North America on these 1 to 2 week trips. At the same time that we have been increasing that, the number of career missionaries has been going down. So if we view short-term trips as a recruiting strategy, it hasn't been successful. If we view it for something else, then it possibly is successful. And so you got to define what your goal is or what you're trying to accomplish through that short-term trip. I was in a conference a while back that everyone was there talking about short-term trips, and that was the reason for the conference. And they said we basically moved short-term trips from being for the benefit of the people that we're going to minister to being used as a discipleship program for our church. And so for the first time in history, missions has become for our benefit, not for theirs. And so things are twisting and changing here in the way we perceive missions. Now, if you're going to do short-term missions, or if you're going to do missions, may I suggest that you come back to this model and think in terms of a progression of equipping and training, coming back to the question that you were, or the issue you were raising before. My understanding of the local church and the job description of a pastor flows from Ephesians 4:11 and 12, where the pastor and the evangelist is given for the equipping of the saints to do ministry. And the reason why people come to church is not so they can watch the pastor do ministry, but so he can help them and train them and develop them to do ministry, so that I really view the local church as an educational institution, if you want to put it that way. It's a place where we get revved up, where we get trained, where we get encouraged, where we're built up, where we're discipled. Why? Remember the presupposition I gave, the church is not an end to itself? The reason is to fulfill the mission of the church, which is going to be outreach. So we start off with the local church, and the testing ground for people in missions is that they first do it here in Jerusalem. Then we say, okay, now you've got it down pat, you're doing well, let's test you a little bit with Judea. We're going to do a church plant over there in the next county. We want you to be involved in that. Let's see how you do there. Then somebody says, you know what, I love Spanish, and I love people in Argentina. Well, okay, there's some Argentines that live over in this community. Go start evangelizing. Well, I don't want to do that. I want to go to Argentina. What if instead we vetted people and said, you know, you reach Argentines here, then we'll send you to Argentina. You see how the natural progression could take place? We have sort of wanted to jump even before the local church, right over the local church, over Judea, over Samaria, and end up with, and so many of our mission trips are designed that way. So what happens is, someone will sign up to go on a short missions trip to dig a ditch or paint a wall, but if pastor announced we need someone to dig a ditch or paint that wall this Saturday, they never show up. But they'll travel 5,000 miles to do that. May I suggest to you that the model is we paint the wall in your church first, And if you're proving yourself, then we might give you some responsibilities in Judea and then maybe in Samaria. You start learning some cross-cultural ministry and demonstrating you really do love those Argentines and you know how to relate to them. Then we send them. And so once we start thinking in terms of this, it'll start changing the way we approach the mission, not missions, of the local church. Well, I'm running out of time. In fact, I'm already out of time. But here's some questions that it would be good before you start just launching short-term trips overseas. What's the purpose of this trip? Is it for our benefit or is it theirs? How does it fit in the overall vision of the church? So you're saying, there's what we're trying to accomplish. Does this fulfill that? The mission of the church. Is this short-term trip actually doing that? Is it good stewardship? The average short-term trip, you take a group of people, is probably $20,000 to $40,000. Is that the best way for us to invest in the Great Commission? How are we going to measure success? That everybody comes back and says, boy, I'm glad I don't live there, it's too hot. Or is it something else that we're going to use to measure? How do we prepare and train? I don't have time to leave this up here, but there's some resources. There's a lot of people that have done work on as they started to grasp the issue of short-term trips, they've done a lot of research, and there's resources there to help equip and train people. That one, the Next Mile, is a good resource for thinking in terms, how do you do the follow-up when people come back? Because oftentimes people come back and they say, boy, I'm glad I don't have to do that again. And you sort of invested all this time and money, but nothing comes of it. Well, how can we take people to the next mile? And so that resource there has some of it. I never asked what time we were supposed to stop, but I assume it was 7:30, right? And I'm already past that. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, I have one more. I'll stop though. I was going to talk about money. Everybody's interested in money. Hey, if you got to go, okay, if you got to go, just walk out. I won't be offended at all because it's my fault. I've already taken too much time. I realize that. Well, let's talk a little bit about finances. One of the issues, and there's a lot of subsets under finances. One of the subsets is supporting nationals, and there's quite a movement. There's quite a few organizations in the United States that raise money right now to send missionaries, to send money overseas and not send missionaries. In other words, don't send Americans, we're too expensive. Rather, let's hire somebody over there. And we had a discussion of this on our Think Spots. We sort of have a discussion forum in our mission agency, and we're tossing this backwards and forwards, and I copied down a number of the arguments that were given for this, that nationals know the culture and language, so therefore they're a good investment. And all of these sound, there are positives and negatives. There's two sides of these coins. All of us in this room here, or let's not pick on us, let's take another group of pastors. There's a group of pastors in the next state. They all know the language and the culture. Are they all equally effective in their ministry? But they know the language and culture. So you see, knowing the language and culture doesn't guarantee anything. They do know the language and culture, but for some reason, God in His sovereignty oftentimes uses foreigners. Most of us are the result of foreign missions. Yeah, you might have to trace it back a little bit, but all of us were the result of foreign missions at some point. So they do. Some say, well, you get more bang for your buck. And what they mean by that is, if I support a missionary here, for that same amount of money, I could support 5 missionaries there. And that works all right unless you're in a third world situation. I had a pastor that called me a while back, and he was complaining about the fact that missionaries earn too much money. And they were supporting them too much. He said, my principle is that you ought to have a salary that is commensurate to the people that you're ministering to. And I said, you know, a lot of our missionaries would love it if they had the same salary as the people they're ministering to. We got people in Europe, we can't touch their salaries. They're earning double what our missionaries are. So our missionaries would love that. If we actually raise the amount of money that the local people in Europe had, we'd have to double support schedules. And so when we talk about bang for your buck, you're really talking about if we can get somebody cheap, then we'll support them. And so I'm not sure that's a good way to do missions. They never take a furlough. But Paul and Barnabas tended to do that, and there is some benefit of having missionaries come back and spending time with the very church that sent them. They're accepted by the people. Well, sometimes yes, but sometimes no. I've been on mission fields where I've seen a lot of animosity towards guys that are supported by Americans.
That's true.
Is that right?
Yes.
And there's jealousy there that we create. And sometimes they're viewed simply as, hey, he's working for the missionary because it's a good job and a guaranteed salary, and he actually earns more than the rest of us. And so the very thing that we're trying to accomplish works against them because they don't trust this individual because he thinks he's a mercenary. Another argument is that people are too poor to support their own missionaries. It's just not true. There's any missionary in any economy that can support missionaries. They may not be able to send them to the same places. They may struggle with sending them to maybe a Western country, but they can send them somewhere. They can survive somewhere. They can do tent. They can, every country can send missionaries. It used to be America sent all the missionaries. Now it's from everywhere to everywhere. Every church in the world has the responsibility of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost part. So this is a transferable principle on every church everywhere, so they all have to be thinking that way. And that's the way God intended this thing to happen. It wasn't that the Americans were going to bear all the burden of missions, but rather every church was going to send their own missionaries to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. There are places that the Americans can't go, and that is true. And there's places where we can't go in our traditional model, but there are so many other models today that are available to us. And then the higher cost of missions is an argument that is just we're pricing ourselves out of business, and we can't afford missionaries anymore because their support schedules are too high, and that's a whole other subject that we won't have time to get into right now. But you do need to wrestle with some of these issues as you say, let's stop supporting Americans to go, and instead let's just send our money overseas. One of the things that we have to recognize that in an affluent culture of which we are, regardless of how poor you might think you are, we are affluent compared to much of the rest of the world. The easiest thing in the world to do is to write a check. It's even easier to write a check than it is to pray. I think it's healthy for us, for any church, to be sending our kids and our grandkids to the mission field. We need that stress in our life. We need that sacrifice. There are some people that need to go. And the day that some of our kids and our grandkids stop going to the mission field is the day that missions will dry up. Because there's a vested interest when one of our own goes, and I still don't know how to get around the Great Commission that basically says you've got the responsibility for not only Jerusalem, but you also have for Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost part of the world. And we are to take the gospel to every person, every place. And there are still places that we could not hire local people to go simply because there aren't any Christians there to hire. Somebody's got to do the front line, pioneering work, and go there. And so you're going to have to do that. Yeah.
To me, the problem, the fallacy of this argument, in part, is you first must train the national to do the work of the ministry before you start sending them money. I saw this first when we went to Kenya, just as a pastor, but a missionary that had been there for 10 years. You get there, and there's so many people there that lack training. They don't have any training really to do the ministry. Now, I don't know if you ever heard, I heard this in Africa, the churches are a mile wide and a half inch deep. And the problem is this idea of sending money. Who would send money to support a national who hasn't been trained and is really not capable of doing the work? Now, if you train them first, and then the missionary who is training them could funnel money to support them. But what's being left out to me is what you just said. They first must be trained before they're supported. And that seems to be left out of this discussion. You don't just send money. Who do you send it to? How do you know it's going to be spent? And I think in our mission, in your mission, I told the guys, they receive money in the school. But I was under an extreme accountability for finances that we used. I had to report back all that we used every month. And we reported it and received funds. You just can't send money over to overseas to these nationals without accountability. That would be a disaster.
All right, we need to wind this up. Let me just give you the last 2 points, which I was going to talk about, but I won't. One is the idea that increasingly missionaries are raising support from individuals rather than churches. We still have a high value on the local church, but most mission agencies are training their people to bypass the local church and raise support from individuals. That's a trend that I'm not happy with, but that's the way it's going. The other is the faith promise. I think we're going to have to take a look at that with this next generation. And I realize it's raised a lot of money, but there are some ramifications with the next generation that I don't think Faith Promise is going to work with them. Anyway, I'll drop it right there. I've already gone too long. Thanks so much. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, I hope that all that's been shared has started to sort of swirl away in your minds, because missions is something that, as he said, is commended.